off this hour with US President Donald Trump, who has announced that Russia and Ukraine will begin immediate ceasefire negotiations following his call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Trump relayed the plan in a group call with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and leaders from the EU, France, Italy, Germany and Finland. He described the talks as progress towards ending the war, but stopped short of imposing new sanctions on Russia, warning they could derail potential breakthroughs. Let's listen in to President Trump and Russian President Putin on what they've had to say.
About our day. Should I tell you about the day first? My little conversation with a nice gentleman named Vladimir Putin. But we had, actually we had a good talk, and I think that progress is being made. 5,000 young soldiers are being killed every single week on average. And, you know, I was talking to, as I said, President Putin for 2.5 hours. That was being very seriously listened to. We don't like what's happening. We don't like that we should have ever been involved. Would have never happened. But we're respected again as a...
Меня коллеги просили сказать несколько слов о результатах нашего телефонного разговора с президентом Соединенных Штатов. Действительно, этот разговор состоялся, продолжался более 2 часов. Хочу отметить, что он был очень содержательным и весьма откровенным. И в целом, на мой взгляд, в этой связи весьма полезным.
Well, President Putin thanked Donald Trump for US support in restarting Russia-Ukraine peace talks. Speaking in Sochi, he highlighted progress towards a possible agreement. The Kremlin acknowledged discussions on a ceasefire memorandum, but stressed that the negotiations would be complex and without a deadline. Putin expressed readiness to work with Ukraine on a peace accord, though he rejected calls for an immediate 30-day truce, citing unmet conditions. Let's listen in again to Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Прежде всего, я поблагодарил президента Соединенных Штатов за поддержку со стороны США возобновления прямых переговоров между Россией и Украиной по поводу возможного заключения мирного соглашения. По поводу возобновления переговоров, которые были прерваны украинской стороной, как известно, еще в 2022 году. Договорились с президентом Соединенных Штатов о том, что Россия предложит и готова работать с украинской стороной над меморандумом по поводу возможного будущего мирного договора с определением ряда позиций, таких как, например, принципы урегулирования, сроки возможного заключения мирного соглашения и так далее, включая и возможное прекращение огня на определенное время в случае достижения соответствующих договоренностей.
Well, despite Trump's optimism, European leaders led by Germany opted to increase sanctions against Moscow. Trump's reluctance to join raised eyebrows, with one official saying participants were shocked by his stance. Trump stated, "This is not my war," and warned he could withdraw from the process if no progress is made. Meanwhile, Zelensky urged Trump not to make decisions about Ukraine without Kyiv's involvement. He stressed such matters are principal and very important for Ukraine. Zelensky signalled Ukraine's readiness for direct negotiations and proposed a high-level meeting involving key international players, potentially hosted by Turkey, Switzerland or the Vatican. The Vatican has not commented, though. Putin and Trump welcomed its involvement. Let's listen in to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and US President Trump.
Цю війну. Третє, я попросив його перед його розмовою з Путіним не приймати рішень про Україну без нас. І для нас це принципові речі і дуже важливі. Ну і ми домовилися, що буде у нас потім контакт після його розмови з Путіним. Якщо російська сторона запропонує деякий меморандум, і я думаю, що це не буде секретом, тому що завжди ця інформація якимось чином в публічному просторі з'являється. Я думаю, що з нашого боку, після відповідних сигналів, ми, отримавши меморандум або пропозиції руських, зможемо сформулювати своє бачення відповідно, як ми.
I think it would be great to have it at the Vatican. Maybe it would have some extra significance. And I saw that it was discussed yesterday, so I thought, and people told me that they'd be honored to do it. I would imagine they would be. And so, no, I think it would be maybe helpful. There's tremendous bitterness, anger, and I think maybe that could help some of that anger. So having it at the Vatican would be, in Rome, would be I think it would be a great idea. Thank you.
Meanwhile, Putin, whose forces control about 20% of Ukraine, insists any agreement must include Ukrainian withdrawal from 4 occupied regions. He emphasised addressing the conflict's root causes. Critics, including former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt, argue Putin is using negotiations to stall while continuing military operations. Talks in Istanbul last week also failed to deliver a breakthrough. Well, joining us to discuss all of these developments in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war and, of course, work towards peace is Ross Feingold, a political risk analyst who's joining us from Taipei. Ross, as always, thank you ever so much for being here. Just mentioned some comments from the former Swedish Prime Minister there. He says that Putin is delaying these talks as military operations continue. What would be Putin's interest in extending these negotiation talks and allowing conflict to resume?
Putin wants to change the facts on the ground. There seems to be momentum, however small it is, on the Russian side, specifically on the battlefield, that is. And the longer that these talks take to even get started, or once they get started, the longer they take to reach a ceasefire agreement. At the moment, it seems that it does benefit Russia's negotiating position because they do seem to have strength on the battlefield, and they have confidence in that because of the reluctance of the Trump administration to supply Ukraine with weapons. They haven't stopped doing so, but they haven't really started doing so either in the 100+ days that the Trump administration's been in office, only small amounts. So if one is looking at this from Putin's perspective, he certainly wants to draw out these processes.
Yes, Ross, let's now look at these conversations that Donald Trump has held. Of course, direct talks with Vladimir Putin for over 2 hours. It's difficult to know exactly what was said, and Trump's rhetoric is often positive around these discussions that are taking place with Russian officials. But given the fact that talks broke down after a short amount of time in Turkey with no real progress, how hardline do you think Trump's stance with Putin actually was?
I think Trump has made it clear he supports bilateral negotiations, or even bilateral negotiations with the heavy involvement of a neutral third party, such as the Pope. So they spent 2 hours talking. I don't think Trump's message is unclear. It's clear that he does want Russia and Ukraine to talk, and he's trying to convince both sides to agree. What's been changing through this posturing over the past few weeks prior to the negotiation session last Friday in Istanbul, as well as what transpired yesterday in the talks with Zelensky and with Putin, is what are the parameters going to be? When is this going to occur, and where is it going to occur? There were times when it seemed that Ukraine had certain conditions, such as it wouldn't engage in talks without a ceasefire, and then under U.S. pressure, Ukraine gave that up, and they showed up in Istanbul, but then Putin did not show up in Istanbul last week, and that was a disappointment to the Ukrainian side. So a lot of this is about preconditions, and we see Putin saying, well, I'm going to have a precondition that Ukraine needs to withdraw from even more territory before I have talks. So President Trump is trying to work his way through that. I think President Trump would prefer the two sides just get in a room immediately and really stop this talk about preconditions.
Yes, looking at European leaders led by Germany, as we mentioned, further sanctions to put pressure on Russia to agree to talks and then a ceasefire, of course. How considerable is it that the EU effort isn't currently seeming to be aligned with the US effort completely? There have, of course, been discussions. We know Marco Rubio has held several discussions with European leaders. But in this moment, do you think a show of strength from Western allies and Ukrainian allies is needed to push this forward with Putin?
It's probably not going to push Putin forward just because the Western European countries remain united. From Ukraine's perspective, though, given the change in posture from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, where the Biden administration was really all in on supporting Ukraine, whether with weapons or sanctions against Russia. From Ukraine's perspective, the good news here is that the Western European powers, Germany, France, Italy, and the United Kingdom, among others, remain united. They remain united in supporting Ukraine financially, militarily, and with sanctions against Russia, and even strengthening sanctions. So even though Ukraine is disappointed in the change in U.S. position, it still could take some comfort from a united Western Europe.
Ross, we started with a comment from a critic of Vladimir Putin, the former Swedish Prime Minister, saying that he's extending these negotiations to continue making gains on the battlefield. In your opinion, do you think Putin is pulling the wool over the eyes of Donald Trump, given the fact that ceasefire negotiations have been ongoing indirectly, and also a 30-day ceasefire has been proposed and backed by the United States, yet we're still in this position where Russia aren't changing their stance on what they want, and Ukraine, of course, aren't giving in to certain conditions?
I wouldn't use the phrase pulling the wool over Trump's eyes, because Russia's position seems to be fairly clear. They want to make more battlefield gains, either before, during, or after negotiations with Ukraine. They want to take over these 4 regions. They want Ukraine to agree to things like not joining the EU and certainly not joining NATO. So Russia's positions are fairly clear. There is some movement in Russia's willingness to engage in negotiations, and we saw that with a delegation from Russia showing up in Istanbul last week, even though the level of representation was lower than Ukraine or even the United States would have liked to have seen. So I would say Russia's positions are fairly clear, and most importantly among those positions is they want to change the facts on the ground to the best extent that they can.
Ross Feingold, you will be staying with us, but thank you for providing the insight on that topic. We will